Why can't we just have another year? Why can't we just have 2 more years? If we give the adults more time, the kids don't get more time. Those kids don't get to do 3rd grade someplace else.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Vashaunta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom, powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Well, welcome back, friends, to the Bold by Choice podcast, where we are here tackling the real stuff, the decisions, the challenges, and courageous moves that define great leadership in education. Now, today's conversation is about school closure. It's a topic that we know is deeply personal, often painful, and certainly complex. Across the country, decision makers and schools sometimes have to make the hard decision to close, and communities are grappling with the ripple effects. To all those involved, the decision makers and those impacted who are experiencing this in real time, we want to take a moment to say that our hearts are with you. Our intention today with this conversation is not to sensationalize, but to humanize, highlighting the realities, the hard decisions, and the hopes that closure can sometimes hold.
You know, Vashaunta, having been an authorizer at Central Michigan University for a dozen years, closure was the worst day on the job. But I always looked at it as part of proving the promise. Part of chartering the promise is that if you perform, you get to stay open. If you're a good steward of taxpayers' money, if you operate with integrity, if you follow the law. And yet there were cases for some, they just, were the bad actor, but others over time just couldn't get it done. Declining enrollment, other issues kind of overwhelmed them. And so I developed this theory of will and capacity. Number one, you had to have that will to want to perform. If you didn't have the will to perform, there wasn't much to talk about. We had to figure out how to exit you out. But most people have the will. Then the question is, do you have the capacity? And what does it take to build that capacity? How much time should you be given? Can you do it with the resources you have? Can you attract the talent? We've talked about a lot of those things. So we got a special guest today, Heather Wendling. And Heather's a repeat on Bold by Choice. And Heather, you have seen stuff all over the country. The good and the bad and the ugly, as they say, channeling Clint Eastwood. But closure is never what we want to do, right? We're for kids, we're for schools, we're for success. But sometimes the promise has to be proven, and that is if you don't perform, you don't get to keep your charter.
Totally agree. I have seen the good, the bad, the ugly. I think most charter closures I've ever seen, whether that was up close or from a distance, have all been really emotionally fraught. So I think this is a conversation that folks don't often sort of elect to have outside of those really high stakes decisions. But I'm glad to chat with both of you today because I know that you approach all of these things very sensitively and thoughtfully.
This conversation, big picture, takes me back to 1996. I was a young guy involved with charters, and we hired a communications group, and we did focus groups, and we did urban and we did suburban, and we did 3 of them. And what every group came away overwhelming was saying, if the school doesn't perform, do not put my babies on the street. And it was a real wake-up call for us because in those early days, we were talking about charter schools. They perform, they're held accountable. If they don't, they can be closed. And we thought that was a great message, except the parents. Mm-hmm. And the parents all came back to us in the focus groups, absolutely overwhelming. If the school's not performing, don't put my babies on the street, right? They wanted different types of interventions. So Heather, as we go into this topic, what are some of the different approaches to closure that you've seen?
So I've seen, and I think in a number of instances, these are either it could be authorizer driven, right? Some of these approaches, or some of them are board and school leader level driven. And I think it takes a little bit of a different approach as well as just accepting that folks work differently. And there are also people with different levels of self-reflection and acceptance of reality. I've seen in certain contexts where it wasn't even halfway through the charter term. So say 5-year charter term, year 2, maybe, things are not gaining steam in the way that folks would hope. systems are not crystallizing, staff are not mobilizing the way that we'd really want to see. So I've seen authorizers say, even that early, something needs to change, right? Either it's, maybe you need some more board members, maybe you need different board members. Same with leadership, same with the management company. I've seen authorizers be really, really kind of aggressive in having those conversations early and often. But that I've also been on the other side, both as an authorizer and as a consultant, where the schools fought tooth and nail to stay open, largely because what you were just saying about with parents and the community outcry and really sort of begging to look beyond some of that data that authorizers, think is really key. And we know that is really key, but look to what else these schools are offering to the communities and understanding why they were so beloved by the students and the families. And that latter situation is the most difficult thing that I've ever seen or gone through professionally.
Yeah, they're difficult situations, I think, especially when you're deeply involved in them. And so there are two that I was specifically involved with, and we were talking about this last week. One school, I was literally 30 days in on the job, and my commitment early on was I am just going to go do friendly visits to every school. Like that's just the mindset that I had. But this one particular school, I did do that visit, and the intent was friendly, but I was beyond scared at what I saw. I literally walked through a building and went in every classroom. That wasn't my intent, but once I saw the first two, I realized I needed to see more. And so saw no learning going on. Zero learning. There it was like lean on me style in that building. And that was like not okay. Like I was shaken up about it to the tune of I had to go back and work with my team and we did eventually close that school. And then on the flip side, I was involved with another closure from the operational side. So what does that mean? The decision to hand over the charter was made by that board. But I had to figure out basically how to pack up that house, if you will, and move it in terms of the utilities, the equipment, the furniture, all the things that are involved with closing a school. This school, though, was one where the parents were very, very deeply committed to it. And it was happening on a very quick timeline, and there were just a lot of factors involved. And so my heart always says, like, I never want to have to help someone go through a closure again, having deeply witnessed what it does to community and having been that person to be like going through a building where nothing good for kids is happening, to be the one who initiated that process. So I sit on like both sides of the house because of Jim. You said it, like my commitment is to the promise to kids. And I had to be a steward of that in the work that I was doing. So I just wanted to offer that to the space. Like this is so real, not just to me, but to many folks who have had to have these conversations.
I used to joke and still do sometimes, but it's a serious topic. It's not a joke. But what I mean by that is, as an authorizer, you never want to get too good at closure, right?
Mm-hmm.
It should be a rare event.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, you want to handle it well. Yes, you want to handle it professionally, but you never want to be closing so many schools that you get good at it because that's not why we exist. And so I had a father that had a lot of sayings, and one of them was an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so can the quality application review process, can the quality year zero startup, the things we've talked about so far in this first season of Bold by Choice, how can we learn from those lessons so that we don't have these closures, or when we do, they're very, very rare? Well, one of the experiences I had was, again, my time at Central Michigan University, but we had a lady that introduced then Governor John Engler at the Republican National Convention in 1996 out in California. At the time, he was on the short list to become Vice President of the United States. 2 years later, I'm closing her charter school in Detroit. And it was a lesson in procedural due process, substantive due process. But the part that really hit me is I'm at lunch. I get a call from the president's office and said, hey, the president's office is full of people from this school. And I said, okay, I'll be to this spot, have them come over there. And so we went to another part of the university. There's a little girl, I'll never forget that image. So the backstory is Nightline, Ted Koppel's program, is doing a feature story on the school. And in the process, they learn it's going through a contract revocation process. So I show up to this room at the university. It's full of adults and students and Nightline with the video camera. And this little girl, I say kindergarten, but I don't know if she was first, second grade, but she was in her uniform. It's the summer. And she looked at me and said, Mr. Gunner, why are you taking away my school? And to stand in front of a group with video cameras trying to answer that question to a little girl and explain to her that these adults that are all around her caused this, it was like not the position you want to be in. Vashaunta, you said we're going to make this real. That's as real as it gets. That's the first thing we want to ask Heather. Heather, why do schools really close? And are we honest about it?
There isn't one answer to that question, as you know. Going back to your point, I always love to, even in the hardest of lessons, like how can we improve our practice to try to prevent that in the future? And like I've always thought about that a lot. Whether that's, consulting with the school operator or with like a new authorizer, who folks have often asked, like, how frequently does this happen? How do we protect against it? Or sometimes there is an assumption that I've heard say like, well, if we're closing fewer than 25% of our schools, is that good? So reorienting people to understand that this is a rarity. And when it does happen, how do we learn from it? The last time I was talking to you all on this podcast was about the new charter application. I think that's our line of sort of defense number one, but that's not a perfect answer either, because there can be leadership turnover. There can be all different, things that happen over a charter term that, cause decline, that cause, maybe a looseness around the mission, enrollment, competition from, new schools that open or other options that, that put more pressure on that original school. So I think there are a lot of reasons that schools close. I think if we're honest about it, and I think this might be controversial as much as I love my authorizers, I feel like there's typically blame on both sides, right? I think it's the school's, leadership, staff, board. I think often the board also holds a lot of responsibility in this, because if maybe they didn't notice early enough or act with urgency. But I think in a lot of closure situations, if authorizers had reacted earlier or, sort of maybe been more upfront about lack of capacity, I think that there's shared blame every time that we have a school closure. And I think that it behooves all of us to be honest about that so that we can reflect on practices and try to prevent it from happening next time.
Well, it's interesting from a theoretical standpoint, too, because there's a lot of analogy between charter schools and small businesses and being entrepreneurial. And when you look at the business literature, it's something like 80% of small businesses go out of business, right? That the 20% that succeed are the rarity. I've always contended that we better have a heck of a lot better percentage in that when we're dealing with kids in schools and public money. And that's why we want closure to be such a rarity. But that leads you back upstream. And how do you vet applications and preparation and resources to know that people have the will and the capacity to succeed once they're given the privilege to educate kids, receive public money, and get after it under the form of a charter?
It's one of the reasons I love the concepts around early indicators, right? Like, how do we make sure board members, authorizers, and the schools themselves, especially if they're connected to networks with additional capacity, what is it that you're really looking for that would help you say, hold up, this is major. And if we don't adjust course so that we can make sure that we go on a better path, for example, what do you mean, Vashaunta? If we know that test scores in ELA and math and any of those end of course exams are below a certain threshold after 2-3 years, that's the sign, right? We've got to adjust course quickly, or that school may be headed toward a closure. Same thing with some of the financial indicators and operational. And one of the things I love that we are pushing the conversation on these days are paying attention to both what you all said, the application and making sure we're not even pressing go. Don't pass go or collect $200 unless you meet these metrics. And then second, so you're halfway around the monopoly board, but if something happens, what are those get out of jail free cards, right? How do you adjust course? What are the resources necessary so that this trajectory can be changed so that maybe you don't have to have the closure conversations? I love that you both brought elements of that up.
There was an era in chartering where it was like a badge of honor if you closed a school for poor academic performance. And the reason for that was because most closures were happening because of poor financial performance, financial mismanagement, waste, fraud, and abuse types of activities. And so it was like, well, did you close a school because it didn't perform academically, as if like that was a higher bar? I think we've moved past that. We don't want to see schools closed, but when they're not proven the promise, that comes with part of the role of the charter board and the charter authorizer. And I know some really outstanding authorizers now. One of their approaches is to help show the data, show the evidence, show examples where the board of the school and the school's leadership voluntarily return the charter. And Heather, I'm wondering if you could share some examples where you've seen something like that in your experience across the country.
Yeah, I've been in several situations where folks surrendered early. It is, I think, the most humane of the possibilities in these situations where even maybe without the authorizer, sort of planting that seed, the board, the community has sort of approached them saying, we're not going to seek renewal, or we think that we're just going to, sort of wrap this up and try to, implement our program through the end of the calendar year. But then we're going to switch our attention to trying to transition kids into the best next option for them within our geographic area. I've also seen where the authorizer really did have to, sort of push on that and reference, how it would be easier not only for staff, but for the students and the families when it isn't a surprise and it isn't, sort of a countdown of, of double-digit days. It is easier and less frenetic and less chaotic. But when I think of the instances of schools that were unfortunately more similar to Vashaunta's example, where there was just really limited teaching and learning going on and school culture was poor, teachers were leaving whenever they had another option, those were typically the boards that least wanted to hear it. Everybody in this work has great experience to contribute, but there can still be a real gap in understanding around where you are relative to expectations. And those conversations are really, really hard. And I think one of the points of communication breakdown is often, why can't we just have another year? Why can't we just have 2 more years? And I think the only real response to that is if we give the adults more time, the kids don't get more time, right? And ultimately, if the school ends up closing or if parents just catch on that this is a school in decline, those kids don't get to do 3rd grade someplace else just because the authorizers or other decision makers have been lenient. And I think at the end of the day, that's the rationale that I think steals people's spines in these decisions.
Which makes me think about community voice. As authorizers, we have standards, we have charter contracts, they contain standards. And yet the consumer, right? The students, the parents, the people that work in the school, they have a voice as well. And they're there every day. And so when they say, hey, there's a problem with the school, that's a perspective. When they say everything's good here, why are you closing it? That's a different perspective. Ideally, the voice of the market, right? People voting with their feet, going to school there, and the voice of the public standards of accountability match. And that's when closure makes sense. It's when they don't match that the tensions and the conflict erupt.
And there's specific examples of that where it's made me rethink, like, okay, how do I even conceptualize it? And I'll tell you loosely what happened the board was handing over its charter, there had been less than expected academic performance. Financially, things were fine. But the community's perspective was that the options that were real for them, so think demographic, what are the schools that are closest to me as a mommy, and knowing all of the things I have to do to get my child or my children to school, were none of them were as safe as this particular school. And that wasn't even like a part of the framework when
Hmm.
the authorizer and the board were having that conversation. And so I think about things that community values that we may need to start paying more attention to, because for parents, there's a whole gamut of reasons for why they choose one school versus another. Heather, I think you had a similar example or situation you were a part of as well.
Yeah, this is one of my like professional sort of memories that I feel like is almost the most embarrassing. So being part of a closure, being part of the evaluation team that did the qualitative and the quantitative analysis to say, nope, this is not getting better. So it no longer makes sense to, to invest public funds in this, right? That's part of the calculation as well. It has to be. But when our analysis was exhaustive around, the imperfect growth and all of those things, right? It was a very solid case that the school was just not academically making it. And that was also impacting its finances. There was a series of public hearings where parents, students, community members were able to come and essentially kind of give testimony. And almost every single one of them, the reason that they really loved the school was culture. Their kids felt joy and they felt loved there. And that issue of safety, the behavior management and the safe environment. It was probably 95% of the parents that spoke referenced that. And you could tell that was, if you had to choose amongst all of these things, right? That was the one non-negotiable that they were really fighting for. And it is hard to think back to that time and realize that that did not meaningfully figure into our deliberations and our recommendation for school closure. And I think that this is something that was years and years ago. I think since then we've learned we've embraced more about social emotional learning and some of those other things. I hope today we would put more weight to that. Although at the end of the day, I don't know where I would stand on that issue of if it's a school that we know is not academically providing kids with the skills to be successful later in life, but it is warm and safe. Looking at other options potentially, like within an urban school district, would we weigh it differently? And I don't know. I would love actually to ask that maybe to our broader community too, to see if there are folks that have used those decision-making criteria differently.
Well, that's exactly why we want to do this episode on Bold by Choice. We want people to be able to hear and think about this because there's multiple perspectives. And it's also why we encourage authorizers and boards to get their values anchored down when it's a sunny day, not when you're in the storm, right? And a closure is a storm. So what are your organizational values? How are you going to apply them? How are you going to use those for high stakes decisions? And how do you stick to them when there's pushback? And closure is a recipe for all of that. I used to say as an authorizer, it was hard to get people to read their charter contract. Until you start talking about closure, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, where's my contract? What is that? Where's that section at? And people start reading the contract. And that's why I advise authorizers all the time. There's procedural due process, like think like a lawyer. Are you following your own processes and procedures? And substantive, what is the case? What is the evidence? And one of the ways I thought about it with the bad actor scenario is why drop a nuclear bomb, meaning you're going to close the whole school and everybody's going to be impacted? Can you take the bad actor out, right? The surgical strike. And I think that's where an authorizer working with a board, working with school leadership can remove the bad actor without having to close the school. So for authorizers to have a few more tools in the toolbox than just closure is a good thing.
Especially there are a few out there, courageous authorizers, and I commend all of you navigating this work right now that are having the conversations of, okay, if we've identified root cause, and let's just say for today's purpose, the root cause is school leadership and a handful of teachers. well, do we have the option of adjusting in those places so that we're not completely disrupting the full community, that full school space, if we are able to help that school and that board make the necessary adjustments? Some add on board trainings to that. All right, let's get with your board and make sure they fully understand their role in this, and understand the school and how the school is really doing. And I'm just going to put a plug in there. No one asked me this, but I just feel like it's necessary to say, as I now serve also as a board member, board members, please make sure you've actually visited your schools and you actually have seen the evidence of teaching and learning. And there's nothing more powerful than being a board member and being able to say with confidence, based on what I've witnessed about what's going on with my school, versus just kind of hearing what may be shared at a board meeting or cursory evidence and data. So I'm just going to put that personal piece out there.
Another call out for board members too: have a sense of urgency about what is a reasonable amount of time to fix something. Schools that we visited, annually, right? Because the more troubled or the more concerned an authorizer is about a given school, typically you show up more. When it was the same discussion with that board a year, 2 years, 3 years in a row, when they hadn't acted with urgency to supplement staffing, to change curriculum, to do whatever those things are, to take action against whatever the weaknesses were, that was also the indication that those schools were not going to get better, because these were not the people in the seats to drive, really, really meaningful change and improvement.
Heather, that brings me back to multiple stories, but, are you going to close a school because they're late on turning in their board minutes? No. Are you going to close a school because they missed a compliance report? No. Are you going to close a school because they didn't do their budget? Well, if they didn't do their financial audit, if their test scores are declining, it's often the totality of a whole bunch of things. And so then when you think procedural and substantive due process, on the substance side, you go for the ones that are easiest to prove, easiest to quantify, easiest to back. But it doesn't mean that there's a whole bunch of other things that aren't problems. My experience is there's problems in every arena, and it overwhelms them. And it's a lack of really operational management. And I'll say the thing that needs to be said: the reality is that often it's the failure of running the school as an institution that leads to closure. Meaning, whether learning's taking place or not, that's harder to see. It's easier to argue about, but it's the operations of the school and that type of lack of organization, lack of fidelity, I'll say it, lack of compliance. Those are the things that get you on the radar screen for closure faster than anything. And it's not any one of them, it's the totality. It adds up.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a school that was anywhere approaching even a closure scenario where they were only weak in one isolated area. I don't really think that happens. Everything is too interconnected.
One of our board members, Sherry Spiegman's from Chicago, and years ago when she was consulting, she had a saying, and it went like this: as you perform, you will comply. But she said that reversed isn't necessarily true, meaning you can comply well and not perform well. But if you perform well, you will comply well. And I've thought about that a lot over the last 15 years since I heard her say it. And there's a lot of truth to that. Your schools that are performing well generally comply well, not necessarily perfect because they're focused on the learning, but they're about excellence in all things, generally speaking. And so they take care of the compliance stuff. And if they don't, and you call them, they're right on fixing it. The frustrating ones, I used to call it trouble takes time. It's where we talk to you once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, you're just consuming all our time because you're not getting it done. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden now we start wondering, can't you get it done? Don't you want to get it done? What's the real issue?
And there's so many groups that play into this, right? All of those different factors are the responsibility of different people. And so I think we're starting to talk about the ecosystem. And so what does it mean for us to have a healthy ecosystem in the charter environment? And within that ecosystem, is closure necessary? I'm interested in how you both approach that.
I think to maintain a healthy ecosystem is we need to live and share really standards for quality. If there's, even in states that have multiple authorizers, if there are some that expect less or that demand less or that, have dramatically lower performance expectations, that is not healthy for all of the other schools and authorizers, right? This is one of those sort of the aphorism, a rising tide raises all boats. I think that also works in the inverse, right? But I wonder, one of the things that I'm concerned about now, where we have such really severe human capital constraints in a lot of places, enrollment, even like birth rate declines, and even, things around with, even just mobility in certain regions and things like that. Are we going to see more in our ecosystem, even schools that are academically strong and that have strong leadership and strong governance? Might they be victims of some of those other factors that we could say are beyond their control, right? If you're in a city that has rapidly gentrified over the course of your charter term and you've lost 30% of your enrollment, and there's realistically not a great way for you to make that up or make budget cuts that make sense, are there schools that are going to be, facing closure or consolidation or whatever opportunity there is, that have done it right in all of the other areas and that were, really solid parts of the ecosystem before these other factors kind of took hold?
A dear mentor of mine, Carmen Anamdi, ran a phenomenal school called Nataki Taliba Schoolhouse of Detroit. And they ended up in a community that gentrified over time, 30 years. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, it just wasn't the same school. And so those issues of birth rates, of attracting talent, housing, economic development, like all of those things are real. And so when you think about a company like McDonald's, right, they're famous for knowing how to locate a site. In the early days of charters, it was kind of like build it and they will come. Mm-hmm. And so as the movement and society evolves, the schools that are going to make it long term are going to be adaptive and responsive to ever-changing needs. And you can see that coming through virtual schools. You can see it in places where they have ed savings accounts, a growing homeschool population. Like one of my base statements is we have more schools competing for less kids. Mm-hmm. And you don't change birth rates very quickly. And so for the foreseeable future, we have more schools competing for less kids. And so I actually think that should be part of charter's advantage because we're designed institutionally to be more flexible and adaptable. But that does come down to the school leaders and the boards and the authorizing agencies working together, looking proactively, right, that forward outlook, and then being able to be nimble enough to adapt and respond to it. Because the one thing that we can guarantee is change is going to continue to come, and pretty rapidly in some states.
It's important for authorizers to be mindful of not oversaturating certain markets, right? Because if we're approving schools that are set up for failure, that are just not going to be able to get, their projected enrollment in an area with lots of other different types of choice that parents are happy about. Again, going back to my earlier comment that as authorizers, we need to own where our decisions or our actions or failures to act influence schools unfairly.
And we can see it, right? Like in education, we talk about disruptors. Chartering 30 years ago was really disruptive force. It was the first time that there was public school choice besides the district where you were assigned to. When we talk about disruption and other things, we talk about, horses to cars, records to streaming music, right? All of those things are easiest for us to see. But when you look at it from an educational society standpoint, those things are coming and impacting learning. As we move from the disruptors to being disrupted, how do we respond in that? And I think that's where it's going to be really important because it's not just the world of schools, it's society, right? The internet changed things. AI is changing things. There is just a big dynamic to this that I think is really going to test leaders because leaders are the ones that are going to have to navigate their teams through this with calm, with grace, with finesse, with urgency, but also with clarity. And that's why Covey's first habit is be proactive. Great leaders are proactive. They don't let things happen to them. They know how to see what's coming and navigate it.
That's right. A pro tip a mentor of mine when I was working in DC shared, and it's just now coming back to me, was that go to your local chamber of commerce or your city planning meetings. Because oftentimes in those spaces, they're talking about population shifts over the next 10 years in that area. They're talking about the infrastructure that is coming or that is outgoing. And so if you're out there, just a pro tip, like stay tuned, include in to what's going on in the cities that your schools are located in to help you with some of that forecasting.
I love that idea because imagine you're the school that's just killing it, but you can see your community's gentrifying. And you went to that chamber meeting and they talk about this growth and you say, "Hey, help us relocate to here. We know how to do learning. Just get us relocated into a great facility over in this new growth area."
Absolutely. I've witnessed it in my community, and it's very powerful the amount of support charter schools can begin to garner when there's a leader or even an authorizer, right? That's very plugged in to the community locally. So we talk about the ecosystem, right? Like make sure that you all are thinking about your local ecosystem and all the players there that could support the movement that you're doing.
And I will also predict this. I think one of the things that's going to happen is there are charters that are going to have to go through some form of merger or consolidation.
Mhm. Yeah.
And if they can drive that versus being faced with closure, again, proactive, positive, make it a win-win for the kids, the educators. But I think there's opportunities because in any fast-growing industry, there's a period of consolidation and mergers that takes place.
And Jim, I think that's a really humane approach. I love that you brought that up. And I want to be clear, it's not that I am anti-closure, not at all. But I am pro-student, right? And so everything I try to do and advocate for is it the best possible potential outcome for the student? And Heather, that's actually a question I wanted to swing around to you. Sometimes a consolidation or a closure is inevitable. So in so doing, what are ways that honor people? What are some processes that make sure that the students, the teachers, the leaders involved are taken care of in a humane way?
So one of the environments that I have always referred back to and I have a lot of respect for is New Orleans. And right, a district with tons and tons of charters. There's a lot of movement, a lot of moving pieces there all the time. So where they have closures, the district has instituted policies and in their enrollment systems and things that if a student is attending a school that is being closed, they are automatically preferenced in the enrollment system so that those kids are going to end up someplace highly rated. That to me is humane from a systems level, right? Because it shows that, all right, so, this school did not live up to the promises it made to that student, to that student's family, to that community. Let's make sure we do better by that family next time from a systems perspective. I think that's a really powerful example. I think the other ways they're not as, sort of embedded, candor and early notification, I think is also really important. I think a lot of when I was working in schools myself as a teacher, I did not know the stakes really. The first time I worked in a charter school, I knew the kids wore uniforms. I know we had a board. I knew there were some differences. It was not really apparent to me, and I'll own some of that. Maybe I didn't do my own due diligence well enough, but I do think that there's a lot, a big portion of teaching staff and parents and stuff when they're enrolling their kid at a charter school or choosing to work at a charter school. They don't necessarily know that this is truly an option, right? That the school has, a time-bound contract and that's not guaranteed going forward. I think especially because closures are relatively rare, although more, common in certain areas of my state at least. It's not something that's on people's radar as a true possibility. So sharing that information at least 6 months prior to any real determination being made can be more destabilizing for the school, I realize, right? Parents might just, might choose to pull their student, teachers might choose to leave. But I think that is information that we do owe to stakeholders. And I think that that's humane.
Absolutely. And I'll add on to that as someone who personally in my past was impacted by a change that had to happen. And unfortunately, in my scenario, I was notified 2 weeks before that change was going to land. Now, from an employment standpoint, it is totally unreal to expect
Yes.
humans to be able to be let go from their current place without having some real life implications. Say that, and I share that moment of vulnerability for those listening. If you're a decision maker, please consider what it is going to look like, sound like, feel like for those impacted. And then think about if that was happening to you, right? And try to act in a way that you would want to have to navigate that very tough, very hard scenario. What do I mean with kids? It is the most important piece is to think through what are the other real viable options for the students who are going to be in.
Mhm.
And once you figure that out in your geographical area, can you build partnerships with them? Do they have wait lists or do they have open seats? Can you do some of the homework for the parents who may not understand what this all means and give the best possible outcome to all of those babies who, guess what? What'd you say earlier, Heather? They've still got to go through third grade, right? And so part of my advocacy is that as educated adults, we've gotten our education. It is our job, even in the hard times, that we do as much as we can to make sure that still happens.
One of the other things that I've seen more and more authorizers adopting this approach is ensuring that from day one, even from day zero, even during that planning year, that schools put a certain amount into an escrow account in the event of a closure at any given time. Because that story about teachers being let go with 2 weeks notice, that should never happen. So here in New York, one of the authorizers requires at least 75,000 in escrow for closure. Where I think now with other rising costs and things, I think that's upped. The authorizer that I worked for was $100,000. So at least payroll, to provide a little bit of a cushion and contingency for staff. I think that that's not only humane, that should be a non-negotiable.
Vashaunta, we should come back and do a future podcast, Bold by Choice, just on that topic. It's beyond the human side, but now we're into protecting assets, protecting salaries, protecting benefits. How do you make that transition for families? But, in all of this, I think our North Star is what's best for kids. And so if this school closes, is there an option that's better for them? And if not, what's the intervention to get this school to be successful? And that goes back to the early questions, right? The will, the capacity, the time, the resources. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure the kids are in the best possible school they can be.
And friends and colleagues out there, we recognize sometimes that even with the best intentions and the most careful planning, things don't always work out the way that we hoped. And we honor that that's life. But how we end truly matters. It reveals our values. So let's commit to when closure has to happen, that we find ways to honor the space that existed and to honor all of the humans who are impacted and learn what we need to do as ecosystem leaders to change the system so that we continue to get better.
All right, here's your Bold by Choice challenge. Read your charter contract. What's it say about closure? What's it say about renewal? What's the process to get there? What are the standards by which you'll be judged? Flip your role, change your point of view. If you're an authorizer, pretend you're the school leader. If you're the school leader, pretend you're the board. If you're the board, pretend you're a student or a parent. How would you want this to be felt, seen, heard from your position? Because if you are in a closure, communication is key. And depending on where you sit and how you're impacted, what you see, what you hear, what you feel is going to differ. So think about it. And remember, closure isn't just an end. It's a time to model dignity, transparency, and trust in the system you lead. And so no matter where you sit in that chain, we want closures to be dignified. We want them to be graceful. We want them to be professional. And most of all, we don't want them to happen. And so let's take great ideas and great execution and combine them with teamwork, because at Bold by Choice, together, we're proving the promise of chartering.
Colleagues, thank you for sticking with us for this very important conversation. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and share this with someone who may be wrestling with these decisions. And we'll see you next time on the Bold by Choice podcast.